Oh, how lovely to be in the Great Hall with all these people. That's just so fantastic. We could all go home now and it's still worth it. But hopefully I'll say something worth coming for, we'll see. So yeah, as Sajidoti said, recently we've been in this theme of building the Buddha land or the Buddha field. I might use those words interchangeably because I quite like Buddha field. That's quite a nice ring to it. So a Buddha field or Buddha land is, of course, as we've heard, this realm where the positive influence of the beings in it, usually Buddhas or Bodhisattvas, extends out and creates this beautiful environment where people can flourish and grow very, very easily under their influence. And last week, Bodhinaga introduced us to Avalokiteshvara. So he's the Bodhisattva with 1,000 arms and 11 heads. And the myth of the movement and order is that we can all become one of these hands. So that's what Bodhinaga was talking about last week, and how we can become one of these hands and contribute to building the Buddha field in the Sheffield Buddhist Centre. So the question that I was left with and have been pondering is, how can we become really good hands? So the Buddha land or the Buddha field is made of people, of beings, living beings, and that's us. We are the living beings out of which it's made. So we need to transform ourselves to become really good building material for this Buddha land, because at the moment we can give loads, we're giving loads, and that's brilliant. But to the extent that we're limited, to that extent the Buddha field will be limited. So if we can unlimit ourselves and grow and become amazing, infinite beings, then the Buddha field will become amazing and infinite, which is what we want. So luckily, we have an instruction manual for how to do this. And as you'll be unsurprised to learn, it's in the form of a list. And I know, I do love a good list. And this list is the Paramitas. So there can be 6 or 10 of them, but usually 6. So I'm going to talk about the 6 Paramitas. And sometimes that's translated as perfections, the 6 perfections. And Parami actually brought them in her talk, was it 2 or 3 weeks ago? So this is kind of hopefully not totally new to everybody. And it's a list of qualities that describe the Bodhisattva, or you could say qualities that an aspiring Bodhisattva needs to be developing in order to really flower as a Bodhisattva. And I want to say that I've drawn very extensively on a series of talks that Padmavajra gave on these qualities last year, and Vicky's going to put up the link, just because I really have pulled out a lot of what he says, although he talks for about 1 hour and 20 minutes on each one, and I have 30 minutes for all 6. So obviously I'm not going to be able to say loads, but I'll give you a little flavour, hopefully. And if you want to go more into detail, you could go and have a look at Padmavajra's talks, because they really are good. Very grateful to him. And I'm going to be drawing mainly from this book, the Bodhicaryavatara by Santideva, which is the manual that guides to the Bodhisattva's way of life. So I'll be quoting him to sort of give you a bit of a flavour. Okay, so let's dive in then. So Paramita number 1, Dhana or generosity. So it's first on the list, the most fundamental virtue of the Bodhisattva. Why? Well, Bhante Sangha, who sent up this movement and order, he says that it's first on the list because generosity addresses the very, very root of our suffering, the very root of the problem of why we're not bodhisattvas, which is our grasping. And he says the normal human tendency is to take and not to give. That's just how we're wired, and we shouldn't feel like failures because that's what we do. That's what we naturally do that. We tend to look out for ourselves. We are actually the centre of the universe. There are like 20 centres of the universe sitting in this room at the moment. And there's always an element of self-reference in what we do, pretty much. But this is very far away from the Bodhisattva. So a Bodhisattva is infinitely generous. The Bodhisattva is willing to give anything for the sake of living beings, even themselves. And as the ideal Bodhisattva, Bhante Sangha says, is we could simply define a Bodhisattva as someone who gives themselves all the time to everybody. Gives themselves all the time to everybody. And the way they can do this is because a Bodhisattva's generosity is an expression of their deep wisdom. They have seen into the nature of things. They understand we're connected in a mysterious way. They know we're not separate, and it makes no sense to act in a selfish, grasping way. So they're just generous because, of course, why wouldn't they be generous? In fact, you could say they're not even being generous. They're just acting. They're just flowing. They don't see any difference between themselves, the person they're giving it to, or the gift that they're giving. To them, it's just a flow. Not so for us, sadly. Not yet, anyway. It's not going to be like that for us. And I think you could see, I don't know if this is sort of generally how it's seen, but I think you can see the perfections as perfections proper that the Bodhisattvas practice, and then you can see them as training principles that we're growing towards, that we can practice more at our level before we have that deep wisdom. And so a more ordinary human way of practicing it. So for giving for us is going to be a more self-conscious act. It's not going to be that perfection. But it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if it's self-conscious. The more we act on our generous impulses, however small, the more that strand is going to grow in us, and the more that wisdom is going to flower in us. Because when we give something, we are for that moment registering that this other person is as important as us. We are kind of acting against our self-grasping. We are acting against our self-referential tendencies. We're registering that that person matters, and perhaps we're not the centre of the universe. And so generosity, although it's the first one and a very basic act, it's extremely profound, a deep, deep wisdom practice. And we can give in all sorts of ways. We can give things, we can give support, we can give love, time, wisdom, confidence. There are traditional Buddhist lists about this, which I'm not going to go into. But really, the list of things we can give is infinite. It's everything that we have, everything that we are, everything can be given. And eventually a bodhisattva will give themselves entirely for the sake of living beings. And that might seem like a ridiculously impossible task from where we are. But don't despair, Santideva says. He says the guide enjoins giving only vegetables and the like at first, and then later by degrees, one acts in such a way that one is able even to give up one's own flesh. So the teaching here is start small. Start with vegetables. They don't matter. We give a cabbage away, the world's not going to end, clearly. So we try something maybe a bit more. We give a day up to help paint the Buddhist Centre, as so many people did. And then we think, okay, the world still didn't end. Okay, maybe we do something a bit bigger. And gradually, our sense of self loosens and stretches. And we can start challenging ourselves more and more. And then before we know it, we've become this incredibly generous person, infinitely generous. So don't despair, it's just practice. That's what Santideva says. One of my own Dhana practices is certainly not on the traditional list. Hang on, I think I'm crinkling. It's certainly not on the traditional list, which is I like to try and let people out when I'm driving, as many people as possible in a journey, especially if I'm feeling really tense and angry and in a rush, because that's when my sense of self is really tight. And that's when it's really important for me to do something generous. And I always find that there's a relaxing of something which is really delicious. It's like, oh, phew, for that moment, I've prioritized somebody over me in a really positive way. And it always has a really lovely effect when I do that. I don't know if that was, maybe they used to let ox carts out or bullock carts out in the time of the Buddha. Maybe it was relevant then, who knows? But it's definitely relevant for us. So that's a little bit about generosity. Okay, next we've got Sila or Shila, ethics or morality. Okay, so this is the deepening of our practice of the precepts. Our commitments to acts of loving kindness, generosity, stillness, simplicity and contentment, truthful speech, and mindfulness. And then also, once we're ordained, additionally, precepts around kindly, harmonious and helpful speech, and also precepts about what we do with our minds as well, how we think. So trying to abandon covetousness, hatred and wrong views. So our ethical practice and our precepts are at the very, very heart of our Buddhist practice. And it's no mistake that when we do the refuges and precepts, the precepts come after the refuges. And Sangha makes the point that our practice of the precepts is the expression of our going for refuge, our commitment to the Buddhist path. As with Dhana, generosity, for the Bodhisattva, they don't think about acting ethically. They just are spontaneously ethical. Their ethics are an expression of their wisdom. You could say they're an embodiment of ethics. And we're very far away from that where we are, similarly to the last one. So we have to strive to go deeper with this if we want to become a really, really strong, robust hand of Avalokiteshvara, if we really, really want to contribute. And how can we do this? It's very interesting, actually, Santideva, when he talks about this. He says very little about ethics, and he talks mainly about mindfulness. He says, he begins the chapter, one who wishes to guard his training must scrupulously guard his mind. It is impossible to guard one's training without guarding the wandering mind. Rutting elephants roaming wild do not cause as much devastation in this world as the roaming elephant, the mind, let free, creates in Avicii under the hells. And that reminds me very much of the story that we hear on the introductory course of that hermit who gets drunk and breaks all his precepts. Have we all come across that? I love that story. And I don't know if it's one every time in all of the intro courses you've done, but I did a lot of intro courses and it's pretty much always one. And I don't think that's just because it was a really funny story. I think it's because it's really true. It's really true that without mindfulness, we can't act ethically. Ethical awareness is at the very, very heart of our ethical practice. It's the primary faculty by which we require for ethics, awareness of ourselves and the awareness of other, because otherwise we can charge around with the best of intentions in the world and cause a sort of damage that a rutting elephant would, which is complete destruction and devastation. And we've probably all known that, had examples of that, where we've acted in a not very mindful way, even with good intentions, and things have gone very wrong. So if we want to think about strengthening our ethical practice to become a really effective hand of Avalokiteshvara, we can think about developing our awareness, which is probably harder than training a rutting elephant. Thinking in the Dhammapada, the Buddha says, the mind is frivolous and difficult to control, alighting on whatever it pleases. It is good to tame the mind. A tamed mind brings happiness. Just find that very down to earth. It's really hard, but it makes you happy. Do it. So really like that. So it's nice homespun wisdom there from the Buddha. So yeah, it's hard. So we've got lots of ways we can tame our minds. We've got the mindfulness of breathing practice, other meditation practices, and also all the other times that we're not meditating, which is also really important to train our minds. And my own personal training practice at the moment is trying to do just one thing at a time. I've got a terrible habit. If I'm doing the washing up, I'll finish something, and then just before I finish putting it down, I'll sort of half be starting to do the next thing. And it's really, really unmindful. It creates a scattered awareness, and I drop things and break things. It's a very, very bad habit. So I'm trying to do one thing at a time. And I find there's a lot more awareness in things, and I just enjoy doing the things much more as well, which is a nice side effect. So yeah, maybe you could talk in your groups about how you work with your minds, how you develop mindfulness. We could share some ideas about that maybe. So moving on quickly to the third precept, which is Kshanti Paramita, which is the perfection of patience or forbearance. So we might have associations with patience in a sort of tense, teeth-gritting, resentfulness sort of way. And if that's your association with it, we need to put that out of our minds, because that's a mistake. That's not what's meant here. We might have these, there's sort of a worldly view that unless we're feeling really tense and grumpy, we're not really being patient. But that's not the Bodhisattva way. So the perfection of patience is Kshanti Paramita is a warm acceptance, receptivity, and imbued with metta. And the Bodhisattva has a deep understanding and compassion for people and the world and why things are as they are. And it's for that reason they don't act with aversion and intolerance in the way that we do. They remain open and warm and undefended, no matter what the provocation. And this quality is seen as being really crucial on the Bodhisattva's path, because patience is the antidote to hatred, which for a Bodhisattva is the ultimate no-no. Santideva says, there is no evil equal to hatred. One's mind finds no peace, neither enjoys pleasure nor delight, nor goes to sleep, nor feels secure, while the dart of hatred is stuck in the heart. I think that's such a good evocation of that horrible, tight, yucky, obsessed feeling that we get when we're in the grip of strong anger and hatred. Which of course is the very opposite of what we're trying to cultivate if we're on the Bodhisattva path. We want to be connected with people all the time. And it's said that for a Bodhisattva, it's a lot better to break your precepts out of craving than out of hatred. Because if you break your precepts out of craving, you're still connected with people potentially. Whereas if out of hatred, you're pushing people away, you're alienating yourself from living beings. So Kshanti is really, really important if we want to not do that. And luckily for us, life is full of opportunities to cultivate patience. Lots and lots of opportunities, lots of potential causes of irritation and anger in our lives. We don't have to try and find them. They're just there. People, for example, biggest source of patience. I mean, people can be really frustrating. I mean, they're great. We love them, and they can be really frustrating. They do things we don't want them to. They get in our way. They have different views from us. They have irritating habits. I find it particularly hard when I feel like I hear someone blaming me or they're being angry with me. And my immediate response is to want to defend myself or maybe even retaliate or say something clever, maybe. Or I also find it hard if I come across somebody who has a view that I find offensive. Find that really hard to not get all huffy and righteous indignation-y at that person and have lots of rants to them in my mind. But as far as Buddhism is concerned, and certainly for a Bodhisattva in training, these sorts of responses are absolutely to be avoided and challenged and not indulged at all. Doesn't mean that we become passive doormats who just let anything happen to us and don't stand up for ourselves. It doesn't mean that. We can still be assertive, but it means that we never give in to anger or hatred towards those people as we do that. We maintain our metta in those situations. So that's people. And then there's just life in general, isn't there? I mean, the last year's been really good teaching in that, things don't go as we want them to. They just don't. And there are external difficulties of life. Things happen we don't want them to happen. The weather, too hot or too cold in this country, things break, and then people die. We get sick. There's lots and lots of suffering in the world, lots of pain woven into the fabric of life. And that needs Kshanti as well. So what do we do about that? I mean, Santideva has loads to say. I don't have the time to say loads, so I'll say maybe a couple of things. He does suggest that we start small. We build up tolerance to difficulties. He says, I love this as well, there is nothing which remains difficult if it is practiced. It's so true. So through practice with minor discomforts, even major discomfort becomes bearable. So yeah, we build it up. I mean, speaking personally, I don't think patience is naturally one of my virtues, I have to say. I can be quite fiery and quick to anger, and I've got quite a critical mind. So over the years, that's got me into trouble, and I found patience quite tricky. But I think over the years, I've definitely improved. And I think the reason is because I've had to work so hard with my poor health, my unpredictable health, which has meant often I've been suffering, I've had a lot of suffering, and I've often not been able to do what I've wanted to do. And it's been a real test of patience over the years. And I think it's spilled over into other areas of my life. So I see that, I still get irritated, but I think I've generally got more of an acceptance of suffering in general, more of an acceptance of my own limitations, of sickness, pain, disappointment, and to an extent of other people as well, although that needs more work. But it's definitely, there's some improvement, and it's just through practice. That's all it is, I think. Another thing he suggests is that we can reflect on the conditioned nature of the things we're getting angry with. He says, whatever transgressions and evil deeds of various kinds there are, all arise through the power of conditioning factors, while there is nothing that arises independently. Therefore, even if one sees a friend or an enemy behaving badly, one can reflect that there are specific factors that determine this, and thereby remain happy. So he's making the point here that we're all conditioned beings, which means the way that we behave are dependent on those conditions. And most of those conditions we have no control over. Is it possible to open the door? Because I'm just a bit hot and stuff. Thanks. That's great. Yeah, so thanks. Yeah, so we don't have control over a lot of our conditions. Often our conditioning has happened before we can even remember it happening. So what a person's doing, however weird it might seem to us, makes complete sense to them and is just the flowering of all their conditioning. It's their conditioning playing itself out, just as ours does when we do weird stuff that other people don't understand. We're all the same. We're no more special than they are. And even if someone's doing something we find hurtful or upsetting, there's a reason for that. And that's actually that person's best attempt to be happy. Even though it seems really strange to us, that is actually what they're trying to do. They're trying to be happy. We can also reflect, which I sometimes like to do. If I was them and I had experienced all the same conditions as them, I would probably be acting in just the same way. I am no more special than they are. I am just as conditioned. So this sort of reflection, if we can bring it into our day-to-day life and maybe even into meditation as well, can be really helpful, especially if I find it, if I'm getting a bit huffy and judgmental and getting all like, oh, why are they doing that? So stupid. Like if I just think, well, there's a reason, I don't know what it is, but we're all conditioned and that's just how it is. It does help actually to let go of all of that huffing, which is much better. And you can do that reflection around things and the way things are as well, you know, that aren't people. So reflecting, well, there is dukkha. We know that. The Buddha said that. Things arise and they pass and they break. They don't satisfy us. We know this is how things are. So why get cross with it? So we can just relax, really. There's nothing wrong. It might be painful, but in a way, this is just exactly how it should be. Dharmamayi talks about forgiving life for the dukkha woven inherently into it. And I really like that, forgiving life. So there's a little bit about patience. Moving on then to the next paramita, which is virya. Virya is the perfection of energy in pursuit of the good. Or as Santideva puts it, the endeavour to do what is skillful. So the Bodhisattva is a being who has endless creative energy in the task of working for the liberation of beings. And it's important to distinguish virya from just any old sort of energy. So virya is specifically energy in pursuit of the good or the skillful. So if you're just running around being busy in a general sort of way, that's not virya. And actually Buddhism would consider that to be lazy, which is worth bearing in mind. And he also suggests that allowing ourselves to dwell in negative states such as despondency or dejection or defeatism would also qualify as laziness. And he has a lot to say about virya. It's a very long chapter. So here's just a couple of things he says about how we can cultivate it. The first one is we can try and cultivate a sense of urgency. So he says, and this is samvega, it's a really great word, urgency. Now that you have met with the boat of human life, cross over the mighty river of suffering. Fool, there is no time to sleep. It is hard to catch this boat again. He's very excited about this. We need to get on with it. We're going to die, quick. And it is like we will wake up. He says, wake up and understand you've got an amazing opportunity here, to practice the Dharma. And we know that from the last year, how quickly things can just disintegrate. The conditions for practice can just fall away from underneath our feet. We really have to make the most of it. That's what he says. The more of this urgency we have, the more virya we have, it drives us. He says, in a moment, life breaks its promise. The second thing he suggests is we can develop our desire for the Dharma. But wait, I hear you say, desire is bad in Buddhism, is it not? Well, no, not completely, because desire for sense desire, which can lead to neurotic craving, that's to be avoided. But desire for the Dharma, definitely, Dharma Chanda it's called, is to be cultivated. And if you think about it, we never really do anything unless we want to, really, if we're honest with ourselves. We have to want to do things to do them. So we have to really want to do the Dharma if we're going to practice it. Otherwise, we won't really be behind it. We'll be a bit half-hearted. So he says we should develop and cultivate this passion and love for our Dharma lives. He says one should be addicted to the task one is undertaking. One should be intoxicated by that task, insatiable, like someone hankering for the fruit of love play. So we're looking to contact that degree of passion and investment in our Dharma lives as the fruit of love play. So it's good to be clear for ourselves, what is it about our Dharma life that sets us off in that way? What fires and inspires us? Because we need to do that. We need to make sure that we do it. Last week I was commenting to my group that it's important, I think it's important to do what's needed, which came up last week in the talk, you know, as a hand of Avalokiteshvara. But I think it's also important to do what you love, because otherwise you're running a bit dry, I find that. If I don't make sure that I do a lot of Dharma study and make sure that I lead study, I don't really care about my meditation practice much. But if I'm doing those other things, it fires everything up. It puts it lights me up, brings me to life. So yeah, maybe you could have a think about what that is for you. So moving on to the fifth paramita, we're getting there, is Samadhi or Dhyana. It depends what list you look in. So Samadhi is a state of absorption that we can get into in meditation. And Dhyana are the refined states that we can access in meditation. So whichever way you look at it, this one is to do with meditation. Sometimes it's translated as meditative absorption. So the Bodhisattva has this endless positive energy, but it's very special energy because it's said that the Bodhisattva, while he's acting in these ways, he's always maintaining the cool place of dhyana within himself. Like he's never leaving that inward space. Everything is an expression of that. So he's deeply engaged with the world, but at the same time, deeply withdrawn. Very, very interesting. So before I go any further, maybe the first most obvious point to draw out is if we want to become a really good hand of Avalokiteshvara, we need to meditate. We need to really care about our meditation practice. If we want to be the greatest service that we can, we need to become the highest and best version of ourselves that we can be. And meditation is a really, really important tool in our toolbox for that. Gradually, over time, purifying ourselves of the hindrances, allowing ourselves to become somebody in whom insight can arise and be sustained over a long time, allowing that then to perfume our practice and our lives more and more. And we might not find meditation easy. I don't. And I've definitely had periods where I found it excruciating and had little breaks from it. But I think it doesn't matter if we find it easy. The important thing is to have a commitment to doing it and trusting that it's going to be having an effect over time. It will bear fruit. So maybe a question to think about is, how much do you value your meditation practice? What could you do to strengthen it? And have you noticed any fruits of your own meditation practice? It's very interesting and significant that most of Santideva's discussion about meditation focuses on reflections about how one should develop compassion for living beings. So that's the point then of meditating for a bodhisattva. So the first meditation, at first one should meditate intently on the equality of oneself and others as follows. All equally experience suffering and happiness. So I should look after them as I do myself. So he's keen for us to recognise there's nothing special about us in the sense that everybody wants to be free from suffering in this exactly the same way that we do. So it makes no sense to prioritise our own happiness over theirs. We're all in the same boat. So that's what he wants us to recognise. He says, I should dispel the suffering of others because it is suffering like my own suffering. I should help others too because of their nature of beings, which is like my own being. Without exception, no sufferings belong to anyone. They must be warded off simply because they are suffering. Why isn't any limitation put on that? So yeah, it's really important to recognise that for a bodhisattva, the point of this absorption and this meditation is to be of more service to people, to not to have a lovely, pain-free, blissful existence, although they do, but to transform them, this is Padmavajra's phrase, to transform themselves into a being who lives solely for others, which is a very, very beautiful image. Okay, and let's finally move on to prajna, or wisdom. So prajna paramita, the perfection of wisdom, or the perfection of understanding. So Santideva says, it is for the sake of understanding that the sage taught this entire collection of preparations. Therefore, in the desire to put an end to suffering, one should develop understanding. So wisdom is the culmination of all the other paramitas. We only practice these other things so that we can develop this wisdom. It's the reason they've been taught. And for Shantideva, the heart of this wisdom is seeing these two levels of reality that Parami introduced us to a couple of weeks ago. So the relative and the absolute realities. So on the absolute level, you could say, things don't really exist in the way that we think they do. So they are shunya, they're empty of this fixed and separate nature that we ascribe to them. So from that perspective, you could say things don't really exist at all. There are no things. There are no people. There are no people to save. On the other hand, you could say, well, of course there are people. We're all sitting here, aren't we? There's lots of people, and there's lots of people who are suffering. That's happening. So this is the great paradox of the Bodhisattva vow, to save all beings from suffering, and at the same time, knowing that really on the ultimate level, there are no beings to save. And the Bodhisattva, because they've penetrated both these realities, their compassionate and their compassionate activity in the world, their attempts to rescue all beings arise precisely out of this insight into the emptiness of those very same beings. Or as Bhante says, compassion is the expression of emptiness. It's deeply, deeply mysterious. I mean, I'm just saying these words. I don't understand this at all. I think Pamavajra makes the point that it's important that we know that we don't understand this. Like, we don't kid ourselves. We have any clue what this means. But I mean, you know, it's good to know. And I said before that the perfections can be practiced on the kind of perfection-y level, but on the more human level as well. But they only become perfections when they are practiced in the spirit of this shunyata, this wisdom, this knowledge of this emptiness. That's when they become perfections proper. And as with all the perfections, as I hope you've picked up as I've been going through them, the point of developing wisdom for the Bodhisattva is not their own happiness, although they are happy, but it's for the sake of the service and liberation of all beings and the deepening of their own compassionate activity. And I think it's really significant that at the end of the Bodhicaryavatara, after he's talked about all these paramitas, all these qualities, what the next chapter, the final chapter, Shantideva gives away everything, all the merits he's gained to living beings. A beautiful, beautiful chapter, evoking all the wonderful things he'd like to see happen to beings from the fruit of what he's been doing, his own practice. Giving everything is given over to serving that goal in the end. So I'm going to finish with my favourite verse in that book, which expresses this wish. So long as space abides, and as long as the world abides, so long may I abide, destroying the sufferings of the world. Thank you.